Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, and welcome once again to Law and Contemporary Problems Animal Law Conference. My name is Anne Hazlett, and I am the rising editor-in-chief of Law and Contemporary Problems. We're so pleased today to join acclaimed scholars in discussions on the timely topic of animal law and policy. For over 60 years, Law and Contemporary Problems has been publishing cutting-edge work on the most significant topics of the times. We continue that tradition with today's conference. As you know, the papers presented today will be published in our first issue of the next volume of the journal, and you may order copies of this issue by finding an order form at the registration table outside. There'll be a break after this if you're interested in picking up an order form then. Let me take a moment quickly to express thanks to those who are responsible for today's event. This conference is the brainchild of Professors William Reppy and Jeff Welty. As special editors of this issue of the journal, they developed this symposium and they marshaled our excellent panel of scholars. Their passion and their diligent work on this topic are evident today, and so many thanks to them. Thank you to Dean Catherine Bartlett, who has provided the journal and the conference with tremendous support. Thank you also to Bob Barker for his role and his support of the practice of animal law. Kelly Oviez of Law and Contemporary Problems really encouraged the journal's involvement in this project, so we'd like to recognize Kelly's valuable input, so thank you, Kelly. And finally, a very special thanks to Kenny Ching, who organized every detail of this conference. We are so grateful to him for his skills and his energy, and I'm sure, as you all have seen today, things are running very smoothly, and we really appreciate all of Kenny's hard work. So please join me in thanking Kenny as well. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today's keynote speaker. Professor Gary Francione is professor of law and the Nicholas D.B. Katzenbaugh Distinguished Scholar of Law and Philosophy at Rutgers University School of Law. Professor Francione received his M.A. in philosophy and his J.D. at the University of Virginia, where he served as articles editor of the Virginia Law Review. After graduation, he clerked for Judge Albert Tate on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and then he clerked as well for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor of the United States Supreme Court. He practiced law at the New York law firm of Cravath, Swaine, and Moore before joining the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania in 1984, where he received tenure in 1987. Professor Francione has been teaching animal rights and law for more than 20 years, lecturing on the topic throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. He is well known throughout the animal protection movement for his criticisms of animal welfare law and for his abolitionist theory of animal rights. Professor Francione joined the faculty at Rutgers University School of Law in Newark in 1989, and with his colleagues started and operated the Rutgers Animal Rights Law Clinic, making Rutgers the first school in the United States to have animal rights law as part of the regular academic curriculum, and the first towards students' academic credit for work on actual cases of animal issues. Professor Francione teaches at Rutgers University School of Law and has authored numerous books and articles on animal rights theory and animals and the law. So please welcome Professor Gary Francione.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. And before starting, I just want to echo the thanks that everyone's giving Bill and Jeff and the folks at the Journal. If anybody in this room has ever put together a conference like this, and Kenny, if anyone's ever put together a conference like this, you know the enormous amount of work that it is. And these folks have been at this now for months. As a matter of fact, I have received more emails from Ken Ching than I have from any other person in the United States. And I met Ken and that was like a sort of a lump in my throat. I felt, Ken. But it's a lot of work, and it's also, I think, a significant long contemporary problems is, in my judgment, and I think the judgment of anyone who knows anything about legal scholarship, one of the most prestigious journals law journals in the United States. And the fact that it is devoting an issue to this topic, I'm not sure if it means it's become so mainstream it's not threatening anymore, which would upset me, or if it means it's becoming part of consciousness. But in any event, I'm delighted that this is going forward. What I'd like to do, I have never in my academic career, this is going to be a first for me, I'm going to read just 3 pages. I have finished my article. It's almost 80 pages long, and I thought, I'll just read it. Not a good idea. What I'd like to do, though, is just read the first couple pages of the introduction, because I worked hard on that to try to boil down 25 years of work into a few pages. And I thought, as I was preparing for today, I thought, well, how do I really explain this and whatnot? And I thought, hell, I'll just read it. So that's what I'm going to do. But I promise I will not do a great deal of reading. First of all, I think that that's very boring. Secondly, I have a new prescription, which I just picked up 2 days ago, and it's not right. I don't know if I had a bad optometrist or what, but or whether the lens grinder was not good. But in any event, I can hardly see anything. So I will try my best. In my 1995 book, Animals, Property, and the Law, I argue that animal welfare laws do not provide any significant protection to non-humans because non-humans are the property of humans. Animals are commodities we own. They have no value except as means to our ends. We may, as a matter of personal choice, attach a higher value to our companion animals, such as dogs and cats, but as far as the law is concerned, even these animals are nothing more than commodities. We do not regard animal interests as having any intrinsic value. For the most part, we protect animal interests only to the extent that we benefit economically from doing so. The result of any supposed balancing of human and non-human interests as required by animal welfare laws is predetermined from the outset by the property status of the non-human as a food animal, experimental animal, game animal, etc. Although we supposedly prohibit the infliction on animals of unnecessary suffering, we do not ask whether particular animal uses are necessary, even though most of the suffering that we impose on animals cannot be characterized as necessary in any meaningful sense. Let me just stop there for a second. I think this is an important point. Everybody in this room, indeed probably everybody in the universe, agrees with the proposition that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. As a matter of fact, I don't believe I've ever met anybody that disagrees with that notion. What do we mean by necessity? Well, whatever necessity means, if you've got a rule that says it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, if that's going to have any meaning whatsoever, it's got to be the case that we can't inflict or can't justify infliction of suffering on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Because if you've got a rule that says, it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on children, but you can inflict suffering on them when it brings you pleasure, then you've got an exception that is so large as to render the rule meaningless, all right? But I would suggest that 99% of the suffering and death that we inflict on non-humans can be justified only by pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Let's just take, for example, eating animals. That's the largest number of animals that we exploit, over 10 billion animals a year for food. Okay? Now, nobody maintains that it is necessary to eat animals to lead an optimally healthy lifestyle. Indeed, an increasing number of mainstream healthcare people are maintaining that eating animals is not good for you. Eating animal products is not good for you. It is an environmental disaster. Animal agriculture is an environmental disaster. It takes between 6 and 12 pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of flesh. It takes 1,000 times more water to produce a pound of flesh than it does to produce a pound of potatoes. Okay, putting aside, nobody maintains it's necessary. The best justification we have for inflicting pain, suffering, and death on 10 billion animals in this country a year for food. And 1 billion is 1,000 million, a huge number. The best justification we have is they taste good. And we purport to take these moral norms seriously, but the bottom line is we don't. We ask only whether inflicting more pain and suffering, we only ask whether we are inflicting more pain and suffering than is required for the particular use. We look to the customs and practices of various institutions of exploitation to determine what is necessary, and we assume that those involved in the activity will not inflict more pain and suffering on their property because it would be irrational to do so, just as it would be for the owner of a car to dent the vehicle for no reason. We do not, for instance, ask whether it's necessary for us to eat animals. We ask only whether the pain and suffering imposed on animals used for this purpose goes beyond what is regarded as acceptable according to the customs and practices of animal agriculture. To the extent that it is customary for farmers to castrate or brand animals, both very painful activities, we regard such actions as necessary, and we assume that farmers would not mutilate expensive animals for no reason. Therefore, the level of care required by animal welfare laws rarely rises above the level that a rational property owner would provide in order to exploit the animal in an economically efficient way. This makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, that animal welfare laws are sort of pegged to the standard that is required in order to exploit animals for a particular purpose. When we try to get the law to move beyond that, what we're really doing is saying to the property owner, we want you to value your piece of property more than you value it. We want you to give it a higher value. That's something that property owners resist, the legal system is not comfortable with, and this is true particularly in a culture that fetishizes property, like this one, in which the law exists to protect property, primarily to protect property relationships. I mean, I think the law of all Western nations does that, but I mean, particularly here, where we really, where the right to property is considered so essential, and so much a sense of, so much a sense of who we are is bound up with what we have. So, let me give you an example. I had an interesting discussion some years ago. Some of my students saw some guard dogs near the law school, and they thought they were being kept in a very, very terrible way, which they were. And so I went over and I looked at the situation. It was dreadful. So I called the guy who there was a sign on the fence with a phone number. So I called the guy and I met with him. And I said, couldn't you, just give these dogs a bit more, a bit better shelter and do a few things that would make their lives, which are terrible, just a bit better? And he looked at me and said, why would I do that? And I said, well, because, it would be better for the dogs. They would prefer that. And he said, I would prefer a bigger house than I have. Do I have a right to it? And I said, no, I understand that. And he said, but I don't understand what you're asking me. He said, why do I have to provide, he said, I'm complying with the law, and the dogs are fine. They're not dropping dead. They're serving their purpose as guard dogs. They're doing what they're supposed to do. Everything is fine. Why is it that you think I have to, what he was actually asking me was, why do I have to assign them greater value? That's money out of my pocket. Why do I have to assign my property greater value? It's my property. I value it the way I want to value it. As long as I exploit it efficiently, the law has nothing to say. As long as I give the dog food and water and provide the level of welfare that is necessary to exploit this animal for this purpose, that's fine. And from an economic point of view, he was dead right. In any event, because animals are property, we treat non-humans in ways that we would consider as torture if humans were so treated. So that was the '95 book. Animal welfare laws don't work because animals are property. Now, I want to say, I did say in that book, actually in the introduction and many times throughout the book, we could treat animals better. Sure, we could. I've never said otherwise. Sure, we could. Even if they remain property, we could treat them better, but we don't. And we have had animal welfare laws for 200 years. And we are exploiting more animals in more horrific ways than at any point in human history. I just don't think they work. In my 1996 book, Rain Without Thunder, The Ideology of the Animal Rights Movement, I argue there are important theoretical and practical differences between animal rights and animal welfare, and that welfarist regulation intended to make animal treatment more humane will for the most part do nothing but make animal exploitation more efficient. Welfare regulation, I maintain, will not recognize or protect the inherent value, that is, value that goes beyond the value of the animal as property of the animal, or lead in some incremental way towards the abolition of animal exploitation. For example, I discuss how federal legislation that supposedly requires the humane slaughter of non-humans for food purposes was justified in the legislation in 1958 and limited to measures that ensured worker safety and reduced carcass damage. I argue to the extent that welfare regulation seeks to go beyond this minimal protection, the property status of non-humans and the political compromise that is required in order to obtain any regulation of property use invariably result in regulations that do little, if anything, to adversely affect the interests of human property owners or to improve the treatment of their non-human property. The primary effect of these measures is to make the public feel better about animal exploitation, which may actually result in a net loss through animal welfare through increased consumption. You know, let me digress a minute. As you can see, this reading this thing was not going to work. I mean, I couldn't resist, jumping in. Sorry, but I'm making a theoretical point and a practical point about animal welfare. I think animal welfare is theoretically problematic. I mean, if somebody says to me, is it better to beat your slaves 5 times a week rather than 10 times a week? The answer is that's a no-brainer. Of course, it's better to beat your slaves 5 times a week rather than 10, but that doesn't address the question about the legitimacy of the institution of slavery. So as a theoretical matter, it seems to me that the idea that what we want to do is try to sort of make exploitation more, make it better. Let's put a, did you ever see that Vanessa Redgrave movie, Playing for Time, where the Nazis put a string quartet on the way to the gas chamber? Is that better than not having a string quartet? Well, I guess to the extent you like music and you're going to be gassed, you might enjoy hearing some music on the way to the gas chamber rather than not hearing music. But does it make the exploitation any better? And the answer is not in my judgment. So I think there's a theoretical problem, but I also think there's a practical problem. I don't think animal welfare works. And it certainly does not lead, welfare does not lead incrementally to abolition, which was a position that was very popular in the 1990s. A lot of the animal groups in this country were maintaining that, well, we all believe in abolition. Remember those days, Lisa? we all believe in abolition, but what we need to do is to move incrementally in the direction of abolition. And what I argued in Rain Without Thunder is there was no historical evidence to indicate that the regulation of institutionalized exploitation in that sense ever led to abolition. A central thesis of Rain Without Thunder, as well as my later work, Introduction to Animal Rights, which I wrote in 2000, is that if animal interests are to be morally significant, we must accord to non-humans the basic right not to be treated as property, and this requires that we abolish and not merely regulate institutional animal exploitation. So I made the argument for abolition and not regulation. And what I also argued both in Rain and in Introduction was that we really need to shift the paradigm. I do not believe, and I'll get into this more, that the legal system is going to lead in the, is going to be at the forefront of liberating animals. I think we need a paradigm shift in this country. I think we need to rethink the whole human-non-human relationship. And in my judgment, as long as 99% of the people in this country are eating animals and animal products, then I do not believe we will ever see any significant improvement in the treatment of animals or any significant change in the human-non-human relationship, for the simple reason that we've got no reason to do this. And yet we all, most of us participate in it. And as long as we are inflicting suffering and death on animals where the only justification we have is our pleasure, further discussion seems to me to be lunacy. In Introduction to Animal Rights, I start the book by introducing you to Simon the sadist. You encounter Simon the sadist, and he's about to blowtorch a dog. And, you ask Simon, why are you doing this? And he says, well, because I really enjoy it. And Simon's otherwise a very nice fellow. It's not that he's like a problem other than this. He's just got this kink. He likes to torture dogs. And I use this as an example, and I've used this in classes and lectures, and I say, is there anybody here that, thinks that's okay? Nobody ever says it's okay. And I say, well, why is it not okay? Well, because, Simon's hurting this dog. Well, what's wrong? I mean, if Simon were a researcher and he was doing burn research, maybe, but even then I don't feel comfortable. But Simon is not a researcher, and he has no reason for doing this except he enjoys it. Then the next question becomes, do you eat meat? Do you drink milk? Because if you do, you're sort of in the same position, except you're paying somebody else to do it for you. You see? And so I think we really do need to rethink from the ground up our relationship with non-humans before we're ever going to see any significant change in the way we deal with them. A number of my critics have argued, although we do indeed treat animals badly, there's nothing inherent in the property status of animals that would prevent us from changing the law to require that animals be accorded better treatment, and that animal advocates ought to pursue incremental improvements in animal welfare. Although I do not believe we can justify the property status of non-humans irrespective of how humanely we may treat them, just as we cannot justify human slavery even if it is humane, I certainly agree with my critics that we could treat animals better than we do. I have, however, argued that the status of non-humans as property militates strongly against significant improvements in that treatment, and that animal welfare will do nothing more than make animal exploitation more acceptable. It's the last paragraph I'm going to read. There can be no doubt that the animal protection community in the United States, and indeed throughout the world, has in the past 10 years achieved a greater degree of economic and political power than at any point in history. Therefore, if my critics are correct, and the property status of animals is not as significant an obstacle as I've claimed it would seem that there should be some evidence of progress that does not fit the model that I've described. That is, there should be some evidence of animal protection that goes beyond what is required for efficient exploitation, reflecting at least a nascent recognition of the inherent value of animals as opposed to their exclusively extrinsic value as property. And then, that's the introduction to the article, and then I tell you what I'm going to do in the various sections, but since we're all friends, I'll tell you myself. In the next section of the article, what I do is I look at a number of measures that animal people point to as victories of the past decade. And I examine them, and I discuss them, and I conclude that if you want to know what animal welfare has done to help animals in the past decade, you need to close your eyes. What do you see? That's what has happened in terms of animal welfare helping animals. I start with fur. Actually, I found a great article by Peter Singer, who is a philosopher who supports what I regard as a welfarist theory. And he singled out two things as great triumphs of the past decade. One was the fact that fur had been, that the fur industry, that the animal rights movement had had a tremendous effect on the fur industry. And the second thing that he pointed out was the campaign by PETA and other organizations to get McDonald's to adopt better treatment of animals that we are consuming. And now let's talk about fur. I mean, the bottom line for fur is I don't know what Peter was looking at when he was talking about the fur industry, but all of the statistics show unequivocally that the fur industry is stronger today than it has been in a long time. Now, that was a central campaign of the animal movement of the 1990s, and yet there has been no improvement in that area. If anything, the fur industry is stronger than it was 10 or 15 years ago. The business with the fast food, with the animal organizations, the supposedly animal rights organizations, making deals with organizations like McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's, which I have very serious issues with. If you look at those supposed changes, first of all, they are based on the work of Temple Grandin. And again, I don't have the time to get into the detail, but the bottom line is let me read you a quote. This is from McDonald's. Animal welfare is an important part of quality assurance. For high-quality food products at the counter, you need high quality coming from the farm. Animals that are well cared for are less prone to illness, injury, and stress, which all have the same negative impact on the condition of livestock as they do on people. Proper animal welfare practices benefit producers. Complying with our animal welfare guidelines helps ensure efficient production and reduces waste and loss. This enables our suppliers to remain highly competitive. There's no recognition that animals have inherent value or they have interests that have to be protected even if it's not economically beneficial for us to do so. We go right back to the issue of what's efficient for us to do. I mean, again, this is the same sort of thinking that led to the Humane Slaughter Act of 1958. We can reduce carcass damage and we can reduce carcass bruising of carcasses. We can reduce worker injuries. We can be more efficient at producing a better product. Now, obviously, to the extent that those measures which make them more competitive and increase economic efficiency, to the extent that they incidentally benefit animals in some way, I mean, I guess, it's better to beat the slaves 5 times a week than 10 times a week. But, but is this really a step forward? I mean, is this really an improvement, in our thinking? I mean, is this a recognition that animals have inherent value? Is this a move away from the property paradigm? I suggest not. There was an act that was passed in 2000 called the Chimp Act, which many animal rights people maintained was the most significant piece of legislation since the Animal Welfare Act. Well, given what you think about the Animal Welfare Act, I guess maybe they're right. I mean, again, what the Chimp Act did was to provide a federal sanctuary, which is paid for in part by the federal government, in part by animal welfare organizations, where chimpanzees that are no longer necessary for research are going to be given, a home. And, there's going to be a sanctuary for chimpanzees that are no longer needed in research. Now, again, that was justified by, there was some interesting discourse surrounding the passage of that act. First of all, it was promoted not only by the sponsors of the legislation, but also by the animal community as being a more cost-effective way of dealing with these animals. Rather than having them warehoused in individual laboratories, it would be cost-effective to put them in a sanctuary. Again, not talking about inherent value, talking strictly in terms of what is efficient to do as a matter of property. What is also very interesting is the sponsors of the legislation made public statements saying, if we don't do this, we risk not being able to use these animals in experiments because people are uncomfortable about using chimpanzees. They have 99.5, genetically, they are very, very close to us. Okay? I mean, there's a 99.5% similarity genetically between us and there's a 1 chromosome difference between us and a chimpanzee. So we're very close. And some people, the sponsors of this legislation argued, are very, very uncomfortable with the continued use of chimpanzees. If we don't do something like this, we risk not being able to use chimpanzees at all in research. This illustrates a point I made in Rain Without Thunder, is that oftentimes, what animal welfare legislation does is make people feel more comfortable about exploitation so that it can continue. In the face of a situation in which there might be a call for abolition, we rush in, we promote some welfare solution that dissipates, reduces the demand for abolition. The Act purports to create a sanctuary for chimpanzees. It has 3 exceptions. If a retired chimpanzee is unique in terms of that chimpanzee's past medical history, then the retired chimpanzee can be used again in research. Now, I suggest to you that that is virtually every animal. You could make the argument that every animal is unique in terms of that animal's past use. So any animal that you want to use, any retired animal you want to use, you can make the argument that's a unique animal. I will tell you, when I used to be involved, as I was for many years, involved as legal counsel for PETA until the mid-90s, I spent a great deal of my youth working on the silver spring monkey case. And I don't know whether any of you are familiar with that case, but that was a case in which there was a federally funded researcher in Maryland, And as a result of an expose, the animals, they were macaques, as I recall. Were they macaques, Bill? They were macaques. And they were taken from the laboratory, and they were transferred to the Delta Regional Primate Center in New Orleans. And we tried to get them out. We wanted to get them into a sanctuary, primarily primates in Texas. And that was a campaign that PETA had and I was helping them with. And the Congress passed a resolution with overwhelmingly in support of transferring the animals to a sanctuary. And the response from the NIH was, we're not going to transfer them to a sanctuary, but don't worry, we promise you. And they put this in writing. They sent a letter to Capitol Hill, and they said, we're not going to put them in a sanctuary, but trust us. We are not going to ever use these animals in research again. As soon as the campaign dwindled down, 2 years, well, not even 2 years, shortly thereafter, they started using them in research, and when there was an outcry, their response was, but these animals are unique. There's scientific necessity. We've got to use these animals, and they ended up doing some pretty gruesome experiments to the silver spring monkeys. In any event, so if the animal is unique, the retired animal can be used. If the Secretary of Health and Human Services finds that it's necessary for public health, the animal can be used again. If there are technological advances that occur that were not in existence at the time the animal was retired, the animal can be used again. I maintain that this is a terrible piece of legislation because what it did was it got the support of the animal rights community, so now we have a federally funded, federally controlled sanctuary which is acting as and the other thing that it does is it reduces the opportunity cost. You know, 5 years ago, before the sanctuary was created, if you were a researcher, the opportunity cost to find out about the profiles of various chimpanzees in federal labs across the country, I don't even know how you would have gotten that information. I mean, I guess you could have gotten it, but the opportunity cost for obtaining that information would be extraordinary. Now, there's a centralized data bank, and the centralized data bank has got all the information that you could possibly want, very easily obtainable. Now, anybody who wants to do research can go to that data bank and find that animal that that person would not have been able to find or not find easily under the old scheme. So now we have this situation where, you know, this is what is regarded by many of the animal rights people as the greatest victory of the past 10 years. I mean, again, I guess victory is a subjective sort of thing, but it would seem to me that if this is a victory, then then we ought to rethink the use of legislation and the utility of legislation in trying to move this ball ahead further. I discussed some other things. I'm not going to get into them. I discussed the California foie gras prohibition. You know, in California, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger signed a supposed ban on foie gras, and again, you know, many people claim that this was a great victory. The problem is it doesn't come into existence until 2012. It was supported by the industry in California because it immunizes them from any sort of claim that what they're doing is in violation of the anti-cruelty law. So in other words, they get immunity until 2012. And when the governor signed the legislation, he said, and I hope that in the meantime, the industry can figure out a more humane way to produce this so that the ban never comes into effect. David Wolfson and Marianne Sullivan were talking this morning about the Israeli ban on this product, and I pointed out that there has been a lawsuit filed recently by the industry in Israel seeking to compel the authorities to test a new tube to stick down the bird's throat that's got a silicone lining. That, you know, it's a shorter tube and it's got like a little silicone lining, and it's supposed to be more humane. And the many animal advocates in Israel are very worried that this is going to prevail. So all of the victory that they fought for many years is in serious jeopardy because now, you know, we've come up with a humane alternative, and it sort of shows the problem with a lot of this, with this whole approach. I talk about the Florida gestation crate ban. I talk about many different sorts of things. I talk about the concept of standing under the Glickman case, which many animal advocates feel represented a real step forward because it now allows animal advocates to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. Read the case. It doesn't do that at all. And I conclude at the end of the section that in the past 10 years, nothing has happened in the area of animal welfare that has provided significant protection to animals. Indeed, if anything, if you can characterize the past decade, we've moved backward. Case in point, the Animal Welfare Act, which applies to animals which are used in experiments, has excluded rats and mice. One of the great campaigns for the whole time I've been doing this is animal advocates have tried to get rats and mice covered under the Animal Welfare Act. Finally, after filing a lawsuit, the Secretary of Agriculture agreed to cover rats and mice under the Animal Welfare Act. Congress then amended the act to exclude rats and mice under the Animal Welfare Act. So rats and mice, 90% of the animals used in experiments, are not even covered by the Animal Welfare Act. This morning, Jeff was talking about covering chickens under the Humane Slaughter Act. Chickens aren't covered under the Humane Slaughter Act. And as I was discussing this with Jeff at lunch, and I was saying, as you were saying that, I was thinking, yes, let's cover, chickens under the Humane Slaughter Act so they can receive the horrible treatment that the cows, pigs, and other animals that are covered by the Humane Slaughter Act receive. And there have been exposés in the past several years showing that the Department of Agriculture is not enforcing the Humane Slaughter Act. So this act, which gives arguably a minimal amount of comfort to an animal in the final seconds or minutes of her life, that's not even being enforced. So what I conclude is basically, I don't see a lot of progress at all. As a matter of fact, I see us in a regression. I think we're going backward. And I think as we're becoming more concerned about things like, bird flu, there's an easy answer to that: stop eating chicken. If we didn't have chicken, if we didn't have a poultry industry, probably wouldn't be dealing with this problem. But because we're concerned about these sorts of things, because we're doing all of this genetic work and we're trying to, we're doing all of this high-tech stuff, the number of animals is going up. And the number of animals is going up in Britain, which has for 200 years had a very, very strident anti-vivisection movement. The number of animals is on the increase even in Great Britain. So what I conclude is it ain't working. It's broke. In the next section, I talk about the structural limits that are imposed by property status. I discuss this mostly in the context of talking about Cass Sunstein. He's the co-author with Jeff Leslie on the piece that Jeff discussed this morning in the second session. Cass Sunstein did a review of one of my books in which he basically argues that the property status of animals doesn't really stop us from treating animals better. And I've never argued to the contrary. I mean, we could treat animals better. We don't. And there are important reasons for that. Because animals are property, there are all sorts of structural and institutional limitations that prevent us from saying, here's something which has extrinsic value. It is property. That's what property is. Okay? I mean, property is that which has only the value we give it. Simplistic, but nevertheless okay for present purposes. And you say, well, but wait a minute, what about landmarks? Well, we don't value landmarks, at a higher, in a more significant way, because we think that the landmark has inherent value. We value the building. We want future generations of humans to be able to visit that building or see that artifact, whatever. But it's property. We value it. It doesn't have inherent value. Okay, and so what I suggest, in responding to Cass, I make the point that yes, we certainly could treat animals better. I mean, there are some marginal improvements. I mean, some animals are treated somewhat better in some European nations. I think we have to be very careful not to exaggerate that. There are some people who think that, it's great, that they would love to sort of go and apply to be, a cow in Britain. Don't do it. It's still a pretty nasty life. There are some marginal improvements. And what's interesting with this bird flu thing, thing. You know, there are several countries that have laws that, you know, that supposedly ban intensive confinement of birds, and those laws are now, you know, now they're moving all the birds back indoors, and we're going right back because, you know, even to the extent that you have that small recognition, the moment some human interest becomes implicated, the animal interest gives way, the animal loses, as the animal always does, you know. And so I talk about this in the next part of the paper. I talk about why I look at property theory from a jurisprudential and philosophical and economic perspective, from those perspectives, and I say, you know, given what property is, economically, philosophically, juridically, you can't really expect a heck of a lot of movement in the direction of recognizing that something which by its nature has extrinsic value really has inherent value. And Cass makes the point that we can recognize the inherent value of animals even if they're property, and I maintain I do not believe that is the case. Then I go on to talk about how some animal advocates recognize that property is a problem, but they say, but we really can't, you know, we're not going to abolish property tomorrow, so the only thing we can do is we can only pursue animal welfare, because if we don't pursue animal welfare through legislation and court cases, then we do nothing. So it's, you know, you either do something or you do nothing. And I discussed that in the paper as a false dilemma, that's nonsense. That it's not a question of you pursue welfarist legislation or welfarist court cases or you do nothing. It's not that at all. Whatever we do, I don't care what it is, we are not going to immediately end all animal exploitation. And there may be a lot of us, and I suspect there are, who don't want to end it, period, and who think that animal exploitation is fine. We just ought to, you know, be nicer to them or whatever. But for those of us who say, yeah, we would like to see the abolition of non-human slavery, we're not going to see that no matter what we do, no matter how creative the legislation is, how creative the court case is. It ain't never going to happen. Not for a while yet. Not in my lifetime. Not in your lifetime. Not in your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren's lifetime. So the question is, what do we do now? And I maintain and argue in the paper, as I have in Rain Without Thunder, but I go back to the argument in the paper 10 years later and say, look, we've got limited time and we've got limited resources. We have choices to make. And what I argue is that there's no real proof that animal welfare reduces suffering in the short term. There's no proof that it reduces suffering in the long term. If anything, it is intuitive, although I don't have empirical studies, but you know, my intuitions tell me, and it's common sense, that to the extent that people feel uncomfortable about animal exploitation, improving animal welfare makes people feel less uncomfortable about animal exploitation. So that doesn't move people in an abolitionist direction. It keeps them exactly where they are. It makes them more comfortable. I mean, I remember when I started shopping at Whole Foods, when I first went into a Whole Foods probably 10, 12 years ago, they didn't sell meat. They did not sell meat. Now they sell meat, and they have all these signs up saying, you know, humanely raised, and you know, all these animal groups support us, and they think we're wonderful. And now they're selling meat. They're selling meat 10 years later. I suggest that is some indication that they're on to something. You know, they're on to something that let's make people feel comfortable. And I believe, Darian, are you going to talk about that? Professor Ibrahim, I think, is going to talk about how, is it correct to say how bogus the Whole Food standards really are? You know, yes, there you go, how bogus they are. And so, you know, they're obviously onto something. You know, that they're hitting that section of the humane community who say, well, I'm uncomfortable about it, but as long as you assure me that, you know, they went to their deaths happily, that they said, here, cut my wrists, I want to sacrifice myself for you, that, you know, it's okay, I'll eat you under those circumstances. So you know, and what I discussed in Rain Without Thunder and what I talk about in the paper is, I got to 3:15, right? So I figured I'll try to go till like 3 and then take questions so people can tell me how much they hate everything I said. All right. What I argue in the paper is that there is an alternative, and that is promoting veganism. You know, that basically, if you believe in abolition, you know, I mean, imagine if you were somebody who was an abolitionist of slavery, and you owned slaves. It doesn't make any sense. If you are, in fact, an abolitionist, then apply the principle of abolition to your own life. You know, as Gandhi would say, just say no. Don't participate in it. One of the arguments I had with folks in the animal rights movement in the 80s, this goes back a long time, is I said, look, rather than putting our money and our time and our energy into campaigns to amend the Animal Welfare Act or campaigns to amend the Humane Slaughter Act or whatever, let's put our money into a unified campaign to educate people about the moral, health, and environmental disasters of an animal-based agriculture. Let's educate people about veganism, because for every person who becomes a vegan, there's a palpable diminution of demand. Gavrik, what is that? You have the numbers. For every vegan, what's the number?
3,000.
3,000. Is that it's annually, right? Yeah. So for every person who adopts a vegan lifestyle, you are talking about a decrease of 3,000 sentient non-humans. I think that's significant. I think if we had put our money in 1985, if we had put our money into a vegan education campaign, would we have turned a lot of people off? Sure. Would a lot of people said, I don't want to be a vegan, I like the taste. Yeah. But my guess is we would have several 100,000 more vegans in this country than we have right now, and we would begin to build a political base in favor of abolition. I heard somebody this morning, I teach at the State University of New Jersey, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. I heard somebody talking about bringing a lawsuit to compel the authorities in New Jersey to have humane farming methods. You want a revolution in New Jersey? Let the Department of Agriculture in New Jersey, I mean, there is no political base for any sort of significant change like that. Absolutely none. People would never support that sort of thing. There is no political basis for abolition. We have no abolitionist movement. We need an abolitionist movement. It doesn't exist. I suggest that had we in '85 put all of our time and our energy into a vegan education campaign, it would have reduced suffering far more than we've reduced suffering with all of the animal welfare that we've had in the past 20 years, not just 10. Let's go back 20 years. Multiply it by 150 million, and you still wouldn't have the diminution in suffering that you would have if you had 250,000 more vegans. So it's not just a question. Nothing we do is going to stop it all tomorrow. I agree. I've never said anything to the contrary. What I have suggested is life is short, resources are limited. What are we going to spend tomorrow doing? Are we going to spend tomorrow, trying to convince a close friend to become a vegan? Or are we going to spend tomorrow trying to get Congress to include chickens under the Humane Slaughter Act so that they can be treated as well as the cows who aren't stunned properly and are tortured in the slaughterhouses? That's a choice you make, but there is a choice. So anyway, and then I also talk in the paper, if we're really wedded to the idea of legislation and court cases, what we ought to try to do is go for those prohibitions, rather than regulations, but prohibitions which incrementally eradicate the property status. Now, I suggest it's going to be really hard to do these things because I don't think that there's enough support for that at this point. I just don't believe that's possible for these things to work. However, they could be interesting from an educational point of view. If rather than saying, let's make the battery cages a bit larger, if you said, let's prohibit battery cages altogether, based on the recognition that these animals have inherent value and intrinsic, they have intrinsic value that can't be compromised even if it's economically beneficial for us to do so, and where we don't substitute or suggest the substitution of a more humane form of exploitation. if one is wedded to trying to deal with this legislatively, because I just don't believe that's possible. I do not believe it is possible to get good legislation at this point in history. There is no basis to believe that that's going to work. And the proof is the past 10 years. Nothing has been produced that is worth the paper it's written on. So I suggest that if we want to, and if we're wedded to legislation, that what we ought to try to do is go for prohibitions that incrementally eradicate property status. I'll be happy to discuss that more in the question period. Finally, well, actually not finally, penultimately, I discuss animal law. Many people maintain that the extant paradigm of animal law, which is basically veterinary malpractice, pet custody cases, pet trust cases, things like that, will have an effect on the property status of animals. I do not believe that's the case. I mean, for example, let's just talk about, there are a lot of lawyers bringing cases now trying to get more than market value for companion animals that have been injured negligently, say by veterinarians, because the standard measure of damages is fair market value. So as we were told this morning, fair market value of a stray of your shelter dog is basically nothing. So if a veterinarian negligently injures your animal, you've got basically no recourse because you won't be able to find a lawyer to bring the case because the animal has no value. So we're trying to get courts now to recognize that animals may have more than value, more than fair market value. I suggest that that is not nearly as dramatic as it sounds. We have in the law recognized that for ages. For example, if I borrow your great-great-great-grandfather's pocket watch, which has no value as a piece of jewelry, has a lot of sentimental value to you, and I damage it, you can sue me, and courts have courts in common law have long recognized that to the extent that fair market value is an inadequate measure of damages, we've got to give you more than fair market value. The fact that we're now treating dogs and cats like your great-great-grandfather's pocket watch, I mean, I guess, one might say that's a sort of a step, but I don't think that's a step. All that's doing is saying that certain pieces of property may be valued in a different way from the way the market values them. And because we respect property so much, we're going to allow the owner of the property to make those valuations. And I don't see that as a significant step. I don't see it as a step away from the property paradigm. And indeed, I'm really concerned. Although some veterinarians do clearly commit malpractice and they ought to be sued for it, I never want to suggest anything which would decrease work for lawyers. But to be frank with you, I am concerned about a policy. Bill, I'm looking at that clock in back of you, and it gives me 5 minutes. That's the official clock, Bill. That's the official clock. But I'm trying to wrap it up. You threw me off my track. Okay. Oh yes, I am concerned about a policy of suing veterinarians because I'm worried that what that's going to do is increase the costs of veterinary services. So people who have less money will purchase fewer veterinary services because veterinary prices will go up because veterinarians will pass along to all of us the costs that they have for their malpractice premiums and what they're having to pay out, for all. I mean, as I say, when a veterinarian does something wrong, the veterinarian ought to be sued. But I think that if it's our policy, if the animal lawyer's policy is let's pursue veterinary malpractice, I do not think, in my view, I do not think that is going to help animals. Indeed, I think and I don't think it's going to move away from the property paradigm. If anything, I'm real concerned it's going to result in the purchase of fewer veterinary services by people, particularly those who don't have much money. And, that's not to say, as somebody at lunch said, are you telling us that lawyers can't do anything? And the answer is no. And in the paper, I discussed the model that we use at the Animal Rights Clinic, which we ran from 1990 to 2000, in which what we try to do, in my whole life, I've never drafted a pet trust, and I've never been involved in a pet custody case, and I've never been involved in a veterinary malpractice case. And I hope for the remainder of my existence on the planet to keep it that way. What we did was we tried we did not see ourselves as at the center of the storm, that we were going to cause the change in the status of animals. We did not see ourselves as revolutionaries. As an old friend of mine, Bill Kunstler, who is now dead, who was a neighbor of mine in New York City, who was a civil rights lawyer, perhaps some of you know him or remember him, but Bill Kunstler once told me, never make any mistake about it, son. We are not revolutionaries as lawyers. We are pimps for the system. And the best thing that we can do, that was the expression he used. And I remember the conversation. We were on the Pulaski Skyway heading from Newark back into Manhattan. The car had a flat tire. I do not know how to change the tire of a car, so we were waiting for the AAA. We were waiting for the AAA on the Pulaski Skyway for an excess of 3 hours. We had a very, very long discussion, and one of the things he said to me, which I'll never forget, is, you know, don't ever get confused. Don't ever think we're revolutionaries. We're not. We're pimps for the system. The best that we can do is to keep the real revolutionaries safe while they foment the revolution. And so what we try to do in the clinic is to protect the vegan activists who wanted to demonstrate and pass out, literature, or the veterinary student who said, I will not participate in any cutting up of a healthy dog or cat. I'm not going to stand there and watch it. I'm not going to watch it on video. I will not participate in it at all. We tried to take cases that were consistent with an abolitionist message. So there is another way. I mean, I just do not believe that lawyers are going to force animals or cause animals not to be property any longer. I just don't believe that that's going to happen. I think if lawyers can play a role, it's in protecting the rights of those people, and I don't believe that they're, I'm using revolutionary, but please, let me make one thing clear before anybody misunderstands. I am not in favor of any sort of violence whatsoever. I'm a complete ahimsa sort of guy. I do not believe in any sort of violence. I do not and will not represent people who are involved in, starting fires or, in this Huntington animal cruelty thing. I just don't get involved with that. So I'm not talking about revolutionaries in that sense. I'm talking about people who are trying to shift the paradigm away from the patriarchal model of violence, which dominates our thinking, which is part of our everyday sort of life, which I think is deeply disturbing. In the final part of the paper, and then I'm just about to wrap up, I go to an issue that Tammy Bryant talked about this morning. In my book in 2000, I talk about how we're going in the wrong direction to the extent that we talk about chimpanzees and dolphins being better than or deserving treatment that other animals don't. I think that's crazy. I did have a chapter in the Grade A Project in 1993, but even in that chapter, I pointed out that I thought sentience was the only thing that matters. It's only the ability to feel pain that matters. Whether you're smart, whether you're, cognitive differences may be important for certain purposes. The ability, for example, some people think recognitional self-awareness is important. Well, all right, fine. If that means you got one comb or one hairbrush left, and the question is, do you give it to a chimpanzee or do you give it to a dog? Dog ain't going to use it. Maybe the chimpanzee will recognize himself and brush his hair or whatever. So give the brush to the chimpanzee. But for purposes of treating either the chimpanzee or the dog as a means to our end in inflicting pain, suffering, and death on that animal, I do not think that there is any difference between a chimpanzee and a dog, just as I don't think that there's any difference between a really smart person and a really dumb person. There may be differences for purposes of who you give a scholarship to. Somebody may merit, it may be in someone's interest more to have that resource, but that doesn't mean, for purposes of using someone as a forced organ donor or as an unconsenting subject in a biomedical experiment, the person who's really smart and the person who's not really smart, in my judgment, are equal. Where I disagree with Tammy is, Tammy doesn't think sentience, and correct me if I'm wrong, we disagree on sentience. I believe that sentience is necessary because I don't think we can talk about non-sentients having interests. I can understand that a tree houses animals and those animals have an interest in that tree not being knocked down, but I do not believe that trees have interests. I don't believe there's anything that a tree prefers or desires or wants. Fish live in the water. Fish have interests. There are things that fish prefer, desire, or want. I do not believe the water has interest. That is not to say that I believe that we ought to exploit those resources for no reason. However, I don't believe they have any inherent value. Those resources only have the value that we give to them, whereas the animal values his or her own interests, even if we don't value them, just as we all value ourselves, even if nobody else values values us. And that's really the basis of inherent value. And now, if I don't take a breath, I'm going to die, and I will be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
The final session begins in 15 minutes. Those of you who just have to have a 15-minute break, take it now. Then the questions will begin. But we are going to get back on schedule.
Okay.
Start the final session at 3:15.
There's also some coffee and things, well, just coffee actually, out by the registration table, if anybody would like some. So be back in about 10 minutes. Thanks.
Begin with questions here in the front.
Hi. I really make that.
You might have to speak up.
That's hard for me. Is that better?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. I really agree with the point that it's impossible to accomplish anything without support on the ground. Hello?
I can hear you. I can hear you fine.
We can't hear that. Okay. So I'm wondering, because I know that so much money is spent by large corporations every single year. There's like so much against what we're trying to accomplish, you know, forces of dark versus forces of light. So I'm wondering if in any of your books, or you have any recommendations of ways to create that political support to move things forward?
I think education, I mean, there are all sorts of creative things that we can do. Education is the most important thing that we can do. Education is labor intensive. It is not as appealing as some of the campaigns that, that are promoted by some of the organizations. I mean, it's hard work. You spend every day of your life saying the same thing. Do you know how many times I have been asked, but what about insects? If I had a nickel for every time I have been asked about what about insects, I would be able to retire, which I would do. But every time you're asked that question, the burden's on you to act engaged, and as if it's the first time you've ever heard that question, because you want to get that person. You want to sort of persuade that person of your position. Education is labor intensive. It is grueling. It is a pain in the neck, but it's the only way. The only way we are going to ever succeed, and by we I mean those people who believe that it's the abolition and not the regulation. Those of us who are interested in getting rid of non-human slavery rather than making it more humane. I suggest that the only way that's going to happen is the hard work of shifting that paradigm. We haven't done it yet. This is the problem. We're still focused on the bifurcation, saying that there's a difference between treatment issues and use issues, and we focus on the treatment issues and not on the use per se issues. And I suggest that was a strategic blunder that we engaged in the 1980s, carried forward into the 1990s, and I don't see us moving away from it at all. So if you ask, what can we do? Educate, 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 and educate more, And you'd be surprised. I mean, look, half of the people in this country, over half the people in this country, have a dog or a cat. That's a hook to getting those people to understanding the issues. And you introduce them slowly to the issues, and I don't generally tell these people that, yeah, I have 5 dogs, and you will not meet anybody in the entire planet that likes dogs more than I do. But let me tell you, if there were 2 dogs left in the universe, and it was up to me about whether they were going to continue to breed so that we could own dogs, the answer is no. I wouldn't do that. But I don't say that right at the outset. And that's okay. I mean, if I'm asked about it, I will answer it honestly. But what I try to do is I say, well, you love your dog? Yeah, I love my dog. Why do you love your dog? I mean, well, my dog loves me back. Really? Yes. Does your dog have a mind? Well, of course my dog has a mind. Does your dog think? Well, of course my dog thinks. So you think your dog has is emotional? Oh yeah, absolutely. My dog thinks. Then they always tell you stories, and you have to sit in there listen to stories about what people's dogs do. And then you say, let me ask you a question. What do you think the difference is between the dog that you love and the cow you stick that fork into? Because there ain't no difference. There isn't, but you just have to try. Education is very challenging, and in a sense, you have to sort of tailor it to people on an individual basis. But I think, as far as I can see, it's the only way. We are not going to succeed at whatever else we're doing. It's not working. I mean, there are things we could do. Somebody mentioned, maybe it was Marianne Sullivan, I don't remember, but somebody mentioned about hitting subsidies, so that we could, because meat is highly subsidized thing, And, to the extent that you get rid of subsidies and make meat more expensive, you can decrease consumption. To the extent that you make meat more expensive, then only rich people can afford meat. That's not the answer, but, it can, there's also a problem with, if you make beef more expensive, people then switch to chicken, and so you're actually killing more animals. So it becomes complicated. But I think ultimately, the only thing we can do is become vegans ourselves and apply the principle of abolition to our own lives, and then try to persuade people of the importance in their lives of that. And look, been doing this for 25 years. I have a huge file of letters I've gotten from students and people I've talked to in groups over the years, and who say, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way, and I gave a talk at the University of Scranton, which is a Catholic school, and I talked about how we feed enough grain in this country every day to animals that we're going to eat. We could give 2 loaves of bread to every human being on the planet. That, to me, I don't care what you think about animals, that, to me, if you care about humans, raises a very important issue. And we've got to grab people where they are.
Yes, gentlemen right here.
If property status is the extreme on this end and abolition or equal rights is the extreme on this end, do you find any, with respect to animal rights under the law, any palliative middle ground that strive for? You said you talked about in the question period about chipping away.
Well, I think that if you are going to pursue legislation, for example, it seems to me that legislation like the Chimp Act, I think the Chimp Act was a disaster. If you're talking about what sort of legislation would you pursue, I would try to talk you out of it. I would say, look, you're better. How much money do you want to spend? I got $100,000 I want to spend on this campaign in 6 months of my life. I would say, take your $100,000 in your 6 months and do education, and you'll get further ahead. And you say, no, I don't want to do education. I want to do legislation. I would suggest to you, try to come up with a prohibition that affects a significant institutional exploitation of animals, where you are prohibiting that activity based explicitly on the recognition that animals have inherent value, and where you don't substitute a supposedly more humane alternative. Now, you would respond to me, I'll never get my legislation passed. And the answer is, yes, that's right. Right now, the only legislation you can get passed is useless legislation. Do you wish to spend your time pursuing useless legislation? It may be something you can fundraise off of, but...
Do you think H.R. 503 fits that? Horse transportation for slaughter bill. Fits that definition?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think that, again, I think that we would be better off. Yes, I think that piece of legislation is better than most. And again, I don't have it in front of me, obviously, and I'd have to look at how it was proposed and what sorts of things were said in its support, etc. But we romanticize about, horses are sort of treated differently in the national mythology. And so we're more...
Differently in the definition of livestock about the USDA when it was defined.
I'm sorry.
Well, it goes back a long way.
Yeah, because when Anna and I had the clinic, we worked on wild horse cases, and there's a certain mythology about wild horses, and there's a certain, most people are horrified to find out that people, that there were slaughterhouses, where horses were being slaughtered in the United States, horses we treat somewhat differently, just like we do dogs and cats. They're more domestic, they're more sort of like family animals. Yeah, there's more of a relationship there. So, the Horse Transportation Act is arguably more in that direction. But again, I don't know that I'd have to look at it closer before I said, yes, this satisfies the criteria I laid out in Rain Without Thunder.
One, two more questions. Yes, in the pink.
The concept of thank you for that excellent talk. The concept of human rights gives people freedom from being owned and killed and eaten. But in a world drifting further and further from social welfare, all humans still have to be productive and work to make a contribution to secure their place in the world. What's the work that animals are going to be able to do to justify their existence?
I don't believe if we took animal interest seriously, we would stop bringing domestic animals into existence altogether. I mean, you know, the subtitle of my 2000 book is Your Child or the Dog, you know, and it's got this little picture of the kid and the dog. That's actually my dog. And you know, the kid's not my kid. And you know, there's because people always say, well, you know, if you were walking by the burning house and you could only save the human or the dog, who would you say? And what I argue in the book is that what we do is we bring domestic animals into existence. We drag them into the burning house, and then we say, gee, you know, what are our moral obligations? And you know, I mean, the fact that we create these animals, stick them in the burning house.
In the future where we're not going to, it's going to be a non-interventionist policy with animals.
The only animals that should be out there are animals in the wild. I do not believe, I mean, I think it's my chapter in Oxford in the Sunstein book. I think I ended by saying, for me, the interesting question is not whether the cow should have standing to sue the farmer for violations of the anti-cruelty law, but why we have the cow here in the first place. And so, yeah, in my ideal world, it's not a question whether animals have rights to sue humans or whether they have standing, whatever. It's we don't have any more domestic animals. Why are we bringing these beings into existence for the sole purpose of using them as our resources? If we took their interests seriously, it wouldn't be a question about what rights they would have, except they would have one right, the right not to be treated as our things. And once we recognized that principle, we would stop bringing these animals into existence. And frankly, as I said before, I love dogs, but I would never, if it were up to me, I would not be in favor of continuing to breed dogs or cats for human companionship. I think that's exploitation. I mean, my dogs, much as I love them, they are totally vulnerable. They are dependent on me when they eat, when they sleep, when they go to the bathroom. They got to hope I don't get involved in one of these discussions and forget to give them water or forget to let them out or forget to go home. You know, they are
they don't exist, right? I mean, and then in some ways, it's like the abortion debate. It's hard to do. How do you debate non-existence versus some level of existence? But in a way, the existence your dogs have is better than nothing. No.
But you could say the same thing about, you know, you could say, well, we could in a few years we will be able to genetically engineer people who are severely retarded. That we'll be able to use as forced organ donors. So you could say, well, you know, they have a nice life, and then when they get to be X years old, we just harvest their organs. I mean, you know, they have a nice life, you know, but I don't think that answers the question. I mean, I think that's...
I'm sorry, we have to end the questions now so that we can move on to our next panel, but join me again in thanking Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you.